Welcome to Gold Derby. I'm senior editor Denton Davidson here with The Color Purple director Blitz Bazawule. Blitz, your story is incredible. You grew up in Ghana, you fell in love with hip hop, pursued that career, moved to the United States and expanded your horizons and art forms. And now here you are, a film director, working with producers like Oprah Winfrey and Steven Spielberg. What has that journey been like? Was this the dream?
Yes, it was the dream, yes, I grew up in Ghana, and before I ever knew of any mediums, any art forms, I drew and painted as a kid. So that's always been my go-to, no matter what art form I've been in. I always start with a sketch. Doesn't matter what it is, music, film, literature. I always start with a sketch because if I can see it, then I can get through it. So that was it for me. Cinema, obviously, is an amalgam of all of these artistic mediums. To make a film, you got to know how to write, you got to know how to photograph, or paint, or frame. You got to know music. You got to be able to score. You got to have cadence, and so it's a very multidisciplinary art itself, and it's perfect for anyone who oscillates between mediums. So this was something that I always had in mind. Now, did I have one of the greatest titles of all time and the greatest producers of all time, Quincy Jones, Oprah Winfrey, Steven Spielberg, Scott Sanders, in mind? No. I didn't even know a path to get to them. There was no path to get to them. But, as fate will have it, you just keep doing your work, and one day you find yourself in a place like this. So I'm truly lucky and grateful for the opportunity.
What made you want to be the person to breathe new life into this classic and bring the musical to the screen, which is, of course, based on the Broadway show?
Well, I can't say that I knew I was the one, you know. I was quite intimidated actually when my agents called me and said I was being considered for this. You know, I didn't have the experience, and I'd made a $40,000 independent movie in Ghana where I'm from. So I was quite intimidated until I went back and I read Alice Walker's book again, just trying to figure out if I, in fact, had a way in. And I found what I was looking for, first page, first line, Dear God, I'm 14 years old, and can you tell me what is happening to me? And I immediately went, all right, anyone who's writing letters to God must have an imagination. And if there's one thing I know, it's imagination. I had to work my way through imagination. Again, in Ghana, there is no path from Accra to Hollywood. It doesn't exist. So I had to imagine my way through all of this. And I felt that if I could lean into that imagination, I could give Celie an imagination that is sprawling. But it also helps me debunk a myth around the fact that people who deal with abuse and trauma are docile and passive and waiting to be saved. I think that's far from the truth. I think people who deal with abuse and trauma are constantly trying to work their way out of this trauma and abuse. And so for me, it just gave me a great opportunity to further emphasize that. And once I figured that out, I was like, well, I think that's it. I think I can truly confidently say I will be contributing something new to Alice Walker's brilliant canon.
And talk about this cast. The performances just big and bold. You have Fantasia, Danielle, Taraji, Coleman as well. They're all getting such great reviews. How important was it to find, those three women at the center to tell that story of sisterhood? And what has it been like just working with them and watching them flourish on screen?
Man, the cast is everything, and especially the trio of women, because they are ultimately the heartbeat of this narrative. Fantasia was doubtful about participating in this film. She didn't want to do it. It was very hard for her to do it on Broadway and felt like she would be revisiting a dark past in her life. but I was persistent, and I showed her the version we were going to make, which was a sprawling imagination for Celie, and she jumped at it because she could relate to what it felt like to be in a dark place and have to imagine her way out of the darkness. And now she is a you know, an incredible. It's a phoenix situation we have on now, where it's just her rebirth is more startling than we could have ever imagined. Danielle Brooks, who had played it on Broadway as well, you know, came with such incredible vigor. Taraji, who was doubtful that she could sing, embraced, you know, the challenge, and to me gives some of the biggest and most show-stopping performances in this movie. Coleman, who, you know, plays such an incredible villain, but a human being, which I think is one that, you know, has in a way brought the character of Mister into modernity, where we can see him as not just his flaws, but as a human being worthy of redemption if he chooses accountability. And so these are things that, I mean, I just was lucky to have masters, and the list goes on in terms of my cast. It is truly an embarrassment of riches in terms of the crew that I had to work with.
And Coleman couldn't be any further away from Mister in terms of sort of their personality. Fantasia, I was lucky enough to be at a screening and that she was speaking at, and she did say that you put her through it with the I'm Here performance. And that she would sing it over and over and over. What was it about that you wanted to get that live element, that feeling of being there? Because there's so many, you know, studio tricks that can be done for a musical. What made you want to have her really be there and present and doing that in the film?
Well, you don't cast Fantasia Barrino and dub her in any way. You know, it's kind of a waste. Fantasia is arguably one of the greatest singers of all time. And she was the cheat code. You know, no matter in what circumstance you put her, she can not only deliver you an incredible vocal, she can deliver a soulful vocal, which is not something that everybody can do. So, I mean, I also knew that was a culminating moment for her character and for her. You know, it was going to be Fantasia Barrino arriving and announcing the fact that she is here to the world. Now, she had done it before on Broadway, but that's a small community. This was going to be for the world. And so, I mean, I'm so thankful that she stuck with it and truly, to me, delivers one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen in a musical.
And the movie takes place in Georgia, and it was filmed in Georgia. I spoke with production designer Paul Osterberry, and he mentioned it was actually the first film he'd ever done that took place in the same state where it was filmed. Talk about that filming experience in Georgia and finding the right locations to tell this story that takes place in the early to mid 1900s.
Yeah, well, for me, it was very important. Alice's book states it very clearly that, you know, it's Georgia, you know, and it's southern coast. And so for me, it was very important that we found that and used that as our kind of base. When I was hired, I'd drive 7 hours a day, location scouting. I mean, that's all I did. I believe location is character. I spend more time on location probably than anything else, because if I can find the place, everything else fits in seamlessly. You know immediately who to cast. You know immediately what they got to be wearing. You know immediately how they got to be moving in the frame based on place. So place is the very first thing for every project, is the first thing I find. Before I think of people, before I think of costumes, design, it's place first. So I was really lucky that, you know, I had the time to do that kind of work. Some of the locations were tricky. You know, like, you know, the swamp, for instance, was one that was not easy. You know, it was man-made, so we had to drain it, build the juke joint, and fill it back up. It takes 2 months to drain, 2 months to fill back up. So that's a logistical nightmare if you want to have it ready to have Suge Avery come on that barge. It's just what it is. So we were very, we worked very hard, but also having Paul Asterberry, who is a master of the craft, and really understood the assignment, which was to create lived-in experiences, lived-in spaces. This movie had to feel grounded. Everything from the angel oak tree that opens our movie and closes our movie. These have to become elements of iconography. And so that was a lot of work to identify all these places that we were going to shoot. The beach, which was going to be a character on its own, needed a unique characteristic. And having all those deadwood trees, I mean, that just became its own world. And that's what I say. The minute I find the place, I know what the girls are going to be doing there. It's just, it was very natural. So, yeah, location is key for me.
And I don't want to give spoilers because before people get a chance to see it themselves, but there's Easter eggs that pay homage to the original film throughout. And your costume designer, who I spoke with, who's fantastic, she worked on the original film. I mentioned the producers that were there. How did you balance, the love people have for that original and paying homage to it with telling your own? This is a new version.
Yes. Well, I mean, the thing is, the original version sits in our hearts, right? And you can't compete with nostalgia because it's not about the movie as much as it's about the environment around the movie. Whether you saw the movie with your grandmother who's no longer here, so it has a sentimental value. You can't compete with nostalgia. So what I told my team day one is we're making an original film based on familiar characters and familiar storylines. And that then allowed us to not compete with Steven's film. It's like, all right, that sits somewhere deep in our hearts. And most of us never went back to watch it. Most of us it just lived somewhere in the back of our heads and minds and hearts. So it was always going to be influential, but we knew that if we were kind of consciously choosing to make an original film and treat this as being the first to ever adapt Alice Walker's book, we'll be fine. So that's kind of what we did.
And the film is through the perspective of Celie, and there's some really cool moments of fantasy and dream. And one of my favorite scenes is Fantasia and Taraji performing together on this giant gramophone. And Paul had told me that was actually your idea to come up with that. And I'm curious, where did you come up with that idea? Because that's such a beautiful moment in the film.
Thank you. I from day one, I needed for us to be able to justify, visually at least, our reason for being, right? Narratively, our reason for being. I mean, The Color Purple is a sprawling, very familiar narrative. Alice Walker's book, Steven Spielberg's film, Tony Award-winning Broadway play. So how can you create something new? I had to go back to Alice Walker's book and found what I was looking for in the first page, first line. It says, "Dear God." And I go, oh yes, anyone who's writing letters to God must have an imagination, a sprawling one. So our work became, how far can Celie's mind go? Then the question became, what's going to trigger these fantasies? Because I also believe in grounding your fantastical sequences. So your audience isn't going, wait, it's more style over substance, right? So my focal point was to go, whenever Celie was going to encounter new information, new innovation, just anything new, her mind was going to kind of just take off and she'll imagine what it does or what it is. A photograph is the first time we see her, her just fleeting, right? And that kind of sends her into this world. Back then a photograph was something that very few people had. So it was novel. When Suge Avery comes, she brings with her a gramophone player. And when Celie winds it, her mind kind of flows. So that was just what it was. It was just like my thing was the same thing with the movie theater. When they see a movie, Celie's never seen a movie before, so her mind floats into this ethereal world that kind of paints this picture for her. And that for me was kind of where I went, okay, we can justify this character dreaming because in all of these elements, she is looking for liberation. If you notice, most of these moments of fantasy are either with her sister or with Suge Avery. That's kind of how they always kind of functioned. So, yeah, I was very excited that we were able to find the balance between the surreal and the real.
And just, I'm curious about just some of the technical aspects in how you achieved the tone and the overall look of the film, and whether that was working with the DP or because when you watch it, it feels warm. Like there's a color palette to it that just feels sunny. It like even through the darker moments, like
Yes.
something about the visual just makes you sort of feel good watching
Yes.
it.
Yes. Well, Dan Lawson and I were Dan Lawson, my DP, and I were very, very conscious of the fact that we didn't want to make a period movie like many people do, which is often desaturated tones and sepias and black and whites. Because we deduced very quickly that the reason we feel that people do that is because they're relying on period photography as their kind of palette. You know, these period photographs have survived sometimes 100 years. Inevitably, they will be sepia. Inevitably, they will be black and white. Dan and I's big notion was we were going to push into the photographs, into a colorful palette, into real life, how people lived back then. And I think that that vivid color itself, whether it's the warm Georgia sun or these incredibly, colorful tones at night, were going to become our visual palette, kind of getting away from how most people would think of a period film as drab and dreary. So those were very intentional, and I think that our movie's better for it.
And just as a final question, the film is released December 25th, but there was a premiere and there's been some initial screenings, and you're able to see fan reactions. I mentioned earlier I was at one. People were hollering at the screen, they were cheering for the musical performances, they were crying, they were laughing. What does it feel like now to finally, after all this time and work, to finally get an audience response?
It is unbelievable. You never know that you're doing the right thing. You're hopeful, you do your research and you try your best, but there's nothing like being in that room and going, my goodness, that little decision that we made has a deep emotional response. And as you said, the response is a myriad of feelings. I've heard, big laughs, big sobs, big gasps. It's a very, very, and the praise has been effusive. And, as an artist of any kind or caliber, there's nothing better than knowing your work is being received in the spirit in which it was made. And I have to say, yeah, we're all in awe of that, the journey. And filmmaking is a massive, massive undertaking, very many people. And so this is a tribute to everybody who had their hand in making this film, my brilliant producers who trusted me and allowed me to make my own movie. Even though they are very vested in other iterations that have existed. So I was truly lucky that I was supported to make my movie, and watching the response has been quite unbelievable.
Well, it's an incredible movie, and as you said, Fantasia is here, and I would say Blitz, you are here as one of the top directors as well. It was really quite an accomplishment. So congratulations and best of luck this award season. And thanks for chatting with Gold Derby today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.